Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
This week, I wanted to continue our talks of identity from last week, where we talked about identity governance and administration. Actually, Adam, you posted this article blog by Alex Weinert, who is one of our security leaders, specifically in identity at Microsoft. And I didn't get a chance to read through it until today when I was making the show, but it's very good stuff, and it talks about the trends that are happening. And then really at the end, he talks about some to-dos or checklists, or he called it New Year's resolution. This was written just a couple weeks back, but anytime, I think when you posted it on LinkedIn, you said anytime Alex Weinert has something, it's worth going through. And so it even prompted me to think about it this week as you and I were talking with some customers, and it was evident that this customer that we chatted with hadn't implemented MFA using OTP. When I kind of, pried a little further, they said, oh yeah, we do allow the app. However, the majority of our users have MFA implemented by answering a security question. And we were on camera at the time, so I couldn't slap my head or really change my facial expression, but internally, I was screaming, right? And I think most of our listeners probably, I would hope, if you're listening to this podcast, you have, OTP MFA and app MFA. Maybe you still have SMS and you're working to get rid of that, but you're moving towards hopefully phish resistant MFA, right? We've hammered on that. So, anyways, this is good timing. There's still people out there who are not on MFA. So Alex's blog is really good. He breaks down identity attacks into 3 different categories: password attacks, MFA attacks, and post-authentication attacks. And we've talked about them throughout our podcast, but it's really good to just kind of put it all into one show and go over it on what these are and then how to mitigate against them. Starting with password attacks, there are 3 dominant attacks. Password spray, which is guessing common passwords against all of different accounts, and very easy to do and automate that. Phishing, where you're trying to convince someone to type in their credentials, either into a fake website or in response to a text or an email. Breach replay, he calls it, which is also known as credential stuffing. And that's where credentials are stolen, and by virtue of percentages, most people reuse their passwords. And so you take those same passwords and usernames and try to replay them or stuff them in another site, hoping that it'll work, because just based on the percentages, a lot of people reuse the same username and password. And these are super easy to automate, execute at large scale. They're practically free. And the statistic that Alex put into the blog was Microsoft deflects more than 1,000 password attacks per second in our systems, which is astonishing. That's a lot. And 99.9% of accounts that are compromised don't have multi-factor authentication enabled. So in this case, again, just hammering it, because there are people out there that don't have it. Driving MFA usage is the most important thing that we can do in order to prevent any type of password attack. So if you're not using it now, enable it for all users.
Absolutely. And with password spray as well as credential stuffing, there are other mitigations, and that's not to be dismissive of them, but multi-factor authentication, of course, is the most effective mitigation. So with password spray, honestly, this is harder to defend against if you're still running your own ADFS environment or equivalent. You're running some sort of on-premises identity infrastructure, because you only kind of have visibility into your corner of the world. And there could be a password spray coming through that's just slow enough that you don't really pick up on it, because it's designed to not trigger thresholds and lock out accounts. That's the whole point. When you move to a cloud identity provider, they often have, at least I know Microsoft does, I can't speak for the others, but I would assume they're doing something like this, at least I hope. They have the visibility across a multi-tenant environment to track password spray attacks much more effectively. Because again, as Andy spoke to, these attackers like to automate these. Of course, nobody's manually password spraying. And when they automate it across multiple organizations, you can start to discern a signal from the noise, and you can take action and block it. And so in a previous Alex Weinert post, he talked about how Microsoft actually has really good ability to detect password spray and stop it because of the multi-tenant environment, because of the breadth and depth that there's visibility into. And then with credential stuffing, one of the mitigations against that is if your identity provider, and again, Microsoft does this, don't want to speak for the others, but assume they do something similar, is looking for leaked credentials posted on the dark web or Pastebin or those sorts of sites, and is basically credential stuffing yourself and checking, hey, did anybody in our environment reuse their password? And if they do, let's flag it. Let's force an automated self-service password reset to mitigate that as well. So there are mitigations in place for some of these, but again, they're so pervasive, they're so cheap and simple for the attackers to deploy, and they have such a high success rate. This is the easiest way in. As we've often said on this show, why go through all the trouble of like finding a 0-day or finding a backdoor or any of this when you can ask enough people, someone's going to tell you their password if you ask enough people. So that is where MFA and some of these other controls are good mitigations.
So let's say you have implemented MFA. You're one of those customers and organizations that have done it. That's awesome. Now we talk about MFA attacks. There's SIM jacking, which is where the attacker is able to go to the telephony provider and authenticate, through their system and get them to swap your number to a new SIM card, which then they have, and you can then get the text message from that number. This is harder to do these days, especially in the US. The major telephony providers are getting better at authenticating people for their accounts, but it is still very common. And so main recommendation is to move away from any type of voice or SMS MFA methods. We've talked about MFA fatigue or MFA bombing, MFA hammering, all the same thing where you're getting just that approval. Your Microsoft Authenticator or your Okta Verify application is just sending, approve or disapprove. And then it keeps on popping up. And, the user will get essentially tired of getting these notifications. Now, there's a graph in Alex's blog, which actually shows the majority of MFA attacks are from voice, which that makes sense to me, because if I keep on getting a phone call, like maybe eventually I might answer it and be like, yo, who is this? And then if they're good about saying, oh, I'm from, so-and-so company, this is the IT department, I'm just trying to get an approval, can you do this, and that makes sense that it was like 58% are from voice, 38% are from push notifications, and only 3% from SMS. So I thought the disparity between the types of MFA and how that affects MFA fatigue was interesting. So definitely move away from voice, because it seems that most people are more annoyed on voice fatigue than any other one. So you want to move to like number matching, right? Or even better, like entering in the number with maybe some geographical context, which isn't everything, but it just adds another layer of signal to the user to prompt them and say, hey, oh, this one's coming from, Canada. I don't know why my signal would be coming from Canada, or even worse, like Russia or somewhere in the Middle East, right? So make sure that you move away from just simple approvals. There's adversary in the middle attack, which is tricking users into doing the MFA authentication interaction. That's kind of similar to the voice authentication, but where someone is calling again and saying, hey, I'm going to trip your MFA. Can you approve that? Right. And same thing with SMS. I could call Adam. I'm going to send you a text with an SMS code. Give me the code. Right. And so that's an attack adversary in the middle. And you can prevent that by moving to phish resistant authentication. And we've talked about that, where literally if you were on, say, a FIDO2 MFA, I couldn't use it because it's the physical key. Like, you're in a totally different location, right? So moving to phish resistant MFA methods, especially for like privileged users or even VIPs who would be more susceptible to these types of attacks, would be recommended. And most of the time, these types of attacks are higher cost. They require more effort. And there's a graph that shows how many per month that Azure AD is seeing for these MFA fatigue attacks. And unlike password attacks, which are like 1,000 per second, these are about anywhere between 30 to 50,000 per month. So a lot less, but the trend is definitely showing between 2021 and 2022 that these are on the rise. So very important to take note.
The biggest problem with the telephony methods plural, SMS and voice, is that you're at risk if there's a weakest link somewhere. And with the telephony model, you have a lot of potential weak links. Maybe you have somebody at the local Verizon store that hates their job and is willing to help somebody out. Or maybe I can just keep calling the phone number at AT&T until I find a CSR who's going to do what I need to do. You have a lot of potential weak links there. The telephony companies have stepped their game up. I have moved a SIM over recently on T-Mobile, and it's much more difficult than it used to be. There's a lot of approvals you have to go through. You have to get a text sent to the phone you're actually moving before you can move it. And you have to do this and that, like validate all this information. So it's really good. Remember, one of their people apologized to me and said, sorry you have to go through so much. I said, no, this is great. As a security professional, I love how hard this is. This should be difficult. But still, you think around the world globally, even, there's going to be different providers with different security levels. And that's just, as an enterprise security department, that's probably one of the things you don't want to farm out to somebody else, especially because you don't have an agreement with them. You don't have an understanding of their security standards, et cetera, et cetera. The MFA fatigue, bombing, hammering, you kind of nailed that, Andy. I don't think there's a lot to add there other than there are effective mitigations today, as you spoke to, with not just number matching, but having to just type the number in with the context matching. That really helps. Now, you could, moving on to your next point with the adversary in the middle attack, an adversary could certainly try to log in to, say, my Microsoft corporate account and trigger that prompt and call me and say, hey, this is, the Microsoft IT department. I need you to read back or to type this number in on your phone. And yes, it says I'm calling from wherever in the world. That's where I am at. That's where the Microsoft Service Desk is based. So you need to do this before we lock out your account. Certainly it would be possible to do that social engineering attack combined with that. And so that's where you got into with adversary in the middle for key individuals, VIPs, as well as privileged accounts, that's where having that phish resistant method is great, because there's nothing to give. Like you said, I can't verbally describe my FIDO2 key to you. It's not going to let you sign it. It's not going to work. So that's a really, really good point. And that's why it's a cat and mouse game. Even with some of these really advanced methodologies, sure, having to type in a number with the location context certainly helps defeat some of them. But for a determined attacker, there are ways still around that. I just went through and completed my annual security foundations training at Microsoft. We have to do it even if you're a security seller, for identity. And they actually touched on this in the training and said, if you're getting the repeated prompts, that's when it's really important to go to our internal sites called Report It Now, and report it, because we can use that information to block that attacker and prevent them from being able to do that moving forward. So they were really encouraging you to notice, hey, if you're getting multiple prompts on your Authenticator app, that's when you call a Microsoft Protect and let our security folks know about it. So some training you can add into your annual security training too is educating folks on these current risk vectors and the action you want them to take, which is probably tell your security team about it, if nothing else. And obviously don't do it would be the other part.
And then finally, the last category is post-authentication attacks. And these are mainly the two categories that Alex talked about were token theft and OAuth consent phishing. With token theft, Adam and I have talked about that too. That's like an evil jinx attack, but there's also other ways to do it. Like if there's malware on your device, that's where they're stealing those tokens that you've already authenticated to. It's a valid user, and you even may have the MFA satisfied because it's post-authentication, but then they take that token to replay it somewhere else, right? And so most of the time, this is something like an evil jinx, or it is malware that is on the device. There are other ways to get the token, but the most common one is usually malware. So definitely look at if you are allowing your users to be admins on the machine, because if they are, that's just one less thing that the attacker has to worry about and can replay those tokens more easily. So I know that can be a contentious topic to remove admin rights. In fact, even Microsoft, I heard through the rumor mill that we might get our admin rights removed from our corporate machines. I get it. But it definitely is not something that most users, especially power users like myself, look forward to. If I have a machine that I'm not an admin user on, then it's very limiting.
Absolutely. And we have talked about token theft many times, and it's one of those things that's really challenging because, to use an analogy, let's say I have my doorknob locks, and then I have a separate deadbolt, and they're keyed separately. So it's two separate keys. And then on my keychain, I also have a tag that says my home address on it, which would be really dumb. And I lose all of that. And an attacker takes that from me. Getting upset that would allow the attacker access to a thing, like wanting to block that's really, really challenging, because I've basically, at a certain point, a key has to unlock a thing. At a certain point, if I have this thing, it lets me in. And that's kind of where you're at post-authentication, when you've got that token, that secret, that access token, that bearer token. You need to protect that secret. You have a responsibility to protect it. And if it gets lifted, well, then you got a problem. Now, are there mitigations against evil jinx? Yes. Listen to our episode on it. Things like device-based conditional access can help, as well as, of course, phish-resistant methodologies, FIDO2, Windows Hello. Sure. But like you said, Andy, it could get lifted in another way. Like, just if I have malware on the machine, if I have admin access to the machine, I can steal the token as well. And it's not like an MFA breach or anything. It's an authentication bypass because you've already done authentication. Now, again, I like to give a lot of benefit of the doubt to other identity providers, but I speak to the one I know, which is Microsoft. At Microsoft, we are doing more to protect against token theft. We now have detections in Azure Active Directory that will notify you if we think a user has a compromised token, like if we think there's token replay occurring. And we'll flag that based on it's 2 different IP ranges or 2 different geographic parts of the world or whatever. We see something anomalous about where that token is being used. And we're working to harden that even further. That's something everyone's trying to do. But again, this is based on industry standards like OAuth and OpenID Connect, how this all works in the browser. So it's not just like a Microsoft thing. I mean, it could be anywhere. Somebody could steal your Twitter access token and do the same darn thing, even if you had MFA on your Twitter account or Facebook account or whatever. It's part of how authentication works on the web. And it's certainly a challenge, and it's something we all want to get better at. And I think there's a lot of improvement in this space, but ultimately got to protect those secrets. And at the end of the day, you got to protect the keys to your front door.
Yeah, and we've talked about OAuth consent phishing too. This is not as common. It's one of the more rare attacks, but it's where someone will trick a user into giving an application permission to access something on their behalf. And OAuth permissions can range from very benign things like being able to read the directory, read the number of users, what groups they're in, to more powerful consents like the ability to send mail on behalf of all users or read all mail or delete mail. So there's very powerful APIs that can be consented to without administrative barriers. And so one of the things that we do recommend is to go into the enterprise applications settings and set OAuth permissions to only verified publishers. You can also set different permissions that you might deem as an organization to be lower risk and have those be automatically approved if that's the case. I know some companies just limit all OAuth consent and have to have their security team approve each one. That could get burdensome depending on how many applications you have to do. So, it's up to your workload and how much you want to take on for approving. But when we turned this on at one of the companies I worked at, we were able to see someone request some application. And when we looked at the permissions for it, we were like, ooh, this is a lot. And we had to explain to them, like, this is a risk to the company. Is this a critical application that you absolutely need? And it turns out it wasn't. So kind of dodged a bullet there. Had we not turned that on, then, that application would have had access. And now, again, if that application were to be compromised, like, you don't have any control of that company. If their application gets compromised, now that access is in your environment, right? So definitely something to keep an eye on. And these are on the rise as well, but not as common as right now. Alex talked about infrastructure compromise. And so some of the key points that I took away from this section was, he talked about reducing your dependency on on-premise infrastructure and shifting that authority to the cloud whenever possible. One of the big things that he talked about was specifically isolating your cloud infrastructure from your on-premises environment. And there was a link to a Microsoft official site, a Learn site that talked about protecting M365 from on-premise compromise. I don't have enough time to go through this today, but I want to do an entire episode on it because when I started reading through this documentation, it was phenomenal. So if you want to get ahead of the ball, just take a look at the show notes. We'll have the link in there, but this was phenomenal information. It's very difficult, I think, to do like 100%, just like anything security, right? As you look at it, there's a spectrum of like, I can do this today and have little impact. These things I need to work on, and these are aspirational, but it's a great template for you to kind of shift away and isolate that cloud infrastructure if you can from your on-premise environment.
We've touched on that a little bit in the past. I haven't read the article you're referring to, Andy. I know Alex has kind of in passing talked about this in past blog posts. And I think this came up a lot. Remember when there were all those like Exchange Server 0 days and then a lot during the, I don't even remember what the name of it was now, but when Solargate all happened, there were a lot of instances where that was how they got their initial foothold. But then the attackers were able to pivot from the on-premises compromise to cloud infrastructure because a lot of customers had that as all one thing. Oh, here's a privileged account on premises. It's also a privileged account at M365. And now I have privilege there too. And I can go on a rampage, or I'm still using some sort of federated identity. So I can literally steal the private keys, make my own tokens, and then just show up to, again, like M365, Salesforce, whatever, and say, hey, I'm the admin, let me in. I'm this person. And because I have the private key, I could sign anything I wanted. They would take it. It looked legit because it was. So I look forward to that conversation as well. I know I brought up a couple of those concepts with customers sometimes, and they thought, to your point, it sounded really onerous because for the longest time, we convinced people like, oh, you really shouldn't have separate accounts in online environments. They should be synchronized accounts because that way, we just talked about this in the last show, Andy, like you have somebody leave the organization, you turn off one account, it turns off all their identities in those SaaS applications as well. I think privileged accounts are a separate thing and need to be treated separately, where you want the opposite behavior. You do want that separate. You don't want there to be a linkage. So look forward to that conversation. But I think that's at least one of the things Mr. Weinert's brought up in the past was privileged accounts. The new guidance is privileged identities in Azure Active Directory should not be synchronized identities, as one example.
Yep. And Alex talked about, towards the end of his blog, the attack velocity and intensity. And I think this rings true with a lot of organizations. As Microsoft, we respond to a lot of different attacks for our customers. And one of the issues that we see is the difficulty that organizations are having in keeping up with the increased volumes and intensity of the attacks. And so, whether it's assisting someone who is running server, 2008 domain controllers that they haven't been able to decommission, or even, this week where Adam and I talked to a customer and they haven't rolled out MFA. I mean, there are organizations who haven't done that yet completely. Just the pace of attacks is hard for organizations to really grasp with, depending on their budgets, depending on their resources, hiring, and they really don't even have enough time to think about security because there's just so much happening, right? One of the key points in this that I know, Adam, you posted about this, but I read it and I was like, this makes sense to me, but it is also crazy at the same time, is that consumer accounts like Outlook.com and Xbox are 50 times less likely to be hacked than enterprise accounts, because for those accounts, Microsoft manages the MFA policy, the risk mitigations, and other security aspects. And so, that just because of that, they're less likely to be compromised. But unfortunately for a lot of organizations, just the cost of trying to implement all of those policies is too much. So the key point to take away from this section is really not to despair. It's just that when you're looking at identity security, you want to try to invest in things that will allow you to be agile, like automating responses to common threats like auto blocking and password changes. Like Adam, you talked about in the beginning, where the comparing compromised passwords in Azure Active Directory. I know that we do this. I'm sure other identity providers do this, but if they become compromised and we're searching for them in that breach replay or credential stuffing, and then we see someone reusing that password within our enterprise environment, it can then trigger automatically a self-service password reset. So no admin, approvals required, no admin action needed. It just sees it. It says, hey, this password has been seen as a breached password, and it puts that user in a sign-in risk high state, triggers a self-service password reset. The next time the user tries to sign in, it says we've detected, so-and-so, and we need you to reset your password. And they just do it. So that takes workload off of your analysts, your engineers to do other things, right? And so that's the main thing to take away from here is, make sure that you're investing in automation and agile policies that allow you to implement other things and get away from the mundane, things that you have to do.
So I quoted that line specifically when I posted a link to this on LinkedIn because I thought that was really profound. Now, certainly Microsoft consumer accounts in many cases are tied to revenue generating services, but they don't have to be. They could be a free Outlook.com account. They could be a free Xbox Live account. They don't have to be something that makes money. So, oftentimes there's this percentage like, well, Microsoft, you have more money than anyone. You can do whatever you want. Money's no object. Microsoft is run by staunch capitalists, make no mistake. And organizations do have to justify their cost. And so the folks that run what we call the MSA, the Microsoft account, obviously they can't just spend money forever because Microsoft accounts in and of themselves don't make money. What I see this as when they're 50 times less likely to be compromised than enterprise accounts, I see this as agility and change management more than it is like ability to spend. I see it as there's not a whole lot of stakeholders to appease. It's something where we can say, this will secure more accounts, will cause less compromise, which leads to these positive things. And somebody says, okay, go do it. And also because we have relatively, I'd say, pretty modern practices on identity management for our personal enterprise accounts. Like it's not a hard lift to make our consumer accounts look similar. So when I posted this, and it wasn't like trying to name and shame, but it was saying a lot of enterprises, I think, have challenges with change management, getting management to buy in on, we want to do this, we want to do that. And I can tell you when I worked in enterprise IT, I had this vice president that my director reported to, and they butted heads a lot. This vice president was like Mr. like nothing can ever be an impactful change ever. And it was like, at a certain point, there has to be impact. I remember I was trying to turn on a conditional access policy for our Intune users where they had to be enrolled in Intune to access company email. And this is one of those where like I had to give like 90 days notice, email, every 15 days. Hey, you've got 75 days left. You've got 60 days left, 45 days left. And he still got anxious when we got down to 14, 10, 7 days. Like, how many people are going to be impacted? I'm like, fair amount. But I've done changes like this before. And there are some people who will not do it until it breaks. They're going to call your bluff. And that's what I'm thinking of when I come from this with modernizing your identity like posture is sometimes things are going to be impactful, but they're so positive and beneficial long-term that they are worth it. Like the 99.9% reduction in the risk of identity compromise by having multi-factor authentication turned on. Clearly off the charts, a worth it endeavor. That said, I like the last call out you did, Andy, and I know you kind of, we're quoting Alex or paraphrasing him, talking about agility in what you deploy. Because this is another thing where I see organizations get wound around the axle. Is I get the perception a lot of time that we talk about identity is the new control plane. Identity is the perimeter. Identity is super important to security. Nobody believes that more than me. Yet I still see a lot of manual intervention, a lot of manual investigation with a lot of low value stuff as it relates to identity. I see people get hung up on really like minor stuff or digging into things that are very unlikely to represent compromise. And so I like to call out here on, there are ways you can make your own life easier. You can automate certain things. You can bake certain things in where if we detect risk, we're going to block this sign in if the risk level is this or higher. And if we detect compromised credentials, we're just going to automatically reset your password and walk you through it and just take care of it. We don't need one of our SOC analysts crawling the dark web for passwords. Microsoft's already doing it. We're already paying them to do it. Why should we do that? And using the breadth and depth of the cloud to scale your threat intelligence, because you get that automatically. You know, if you're with a cloud identity provider, they see so much more than you. If you're rolling your own at this point, ADFS, on-premises identity with Ping or something else, Duo, whatever you got, like you don't have enough threat intel to really run an identity service today, a public-facing identity service. That's terrifying to me. Make your life easier. Let the cloud guys do it. They do it at scale, guys and gals, be inclusive. They do it at scale and they do it really, really well. And whether that's Okta or Ping or Microsoft, I'm not going to play favorites here, although you know who signs my paychecks. Any of those is going to be able to deliver a better identity experience, probably with a lot less effort than you're putting in today. So make your life easier and focus on the things that are value add.
Yeah. What your experience has been is also my experience. And I think it resonates probably with a lot of people who might listen to the show or are in security who have deployed solution or changes. There are some people who will do the thing that you need them to do immediately when they get the email. Mm-hmm. And then there may be a handful throughout that notification period, but then the majority of your users are going to wait until the last minute until it is turned on and it forces them to do it. And so there's no reason to sweat, right? You send out that initial email, you'll get maybe 20% of the people to do the change, and then you won't see hardly anything until you flip the switch. And it could be 6 months later. You could send an email every day for 6 months and nobody's going to do it until you actually flip the switch. And I found that there are fights that you do want to fight, right? Like there's times that you do want to put your foot down and say, this is a major risk. And if you don't, if you don't do this, like we're probably going to need some sort of written statement that, mm-hmm. this is a recommendation that you are turning down for whatever reason. But there are fights that you don't need to fight, right? Like I think we talked with a customer about Windows Defender application control and how he had deployed some other application control or application allow block, solution. And it was so onerous that, the organization was like, rip this out because we don't want our applications to be blocked that we want to install. I mean, that makes sense. And it's probably a fight that I would just back down from because I don't think application control is that useful for users. It's very useful for kiosk machines and one purpose machines that are supposed to be in a single configuration. But yeah, I don't think I would use it for user machines. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so, pick the fights that you want to fight. But there are many that you can probably back down from and let the business decide how they want to manage their security risk. So at the end of this, I thought this was really good. He had a checklist for 2023. So the first one is protect all your users with MFA, always using the authenticator or, of course, like any authentication app would work. If you're using like Okta, it'd be the Okta Verify. Ping has an app. Start migrating to FIDO, Fast Identity Online, which is a phish-resistant MFA. And if you haven't, deploy Windows Hello or Windows Hello for Business, right? That is also a phish-resistant MFA for authentication to your Windows machines. And then we also have certificate-based authentication, which is also phish-resistant. So, multiple different ways to do that. Pick and choose, because you don't have to deploy that for all your users. Windows Hello, for sure, deploy that for all your users, because that's one of the few solutions that, number one, it's better for security, it's phish resistant, plus it's a great experience for users to be able to sign in with biometrics. So definitely do that, and then move to MFA. But FIDO and certificate-based authentication, maybe put those on the back burner until you're able to do that.
I want to make a point there too. And I don't think people always pick up on this. Protect all, I'm quoting now, protect all your users with multi-factor authentication always is how it's written. And there's probably a lot of listeners who go, wait a minute, not always. Like, I don't want my users to get prompted a bunch of times a day. We don't either. I do not want you to do that. If you do that, that is bad for security. Do not make your users prompt for MFA multiple times a day. If you're doing that, you're doing it wrong. Just say it really bluntly. However, you can have it configured that multi-factor authentication is always required in your environment. Now, if you're configured correctly, users just shouldn't have to authenticate multiple times a day or even a week, really, in many cases. Like if I'm signed into, say, the Outlook app on my iPhone, I shouldn't have to sign into that like hardly ever, as long as I'm regularly using it until my password expires, which you shouldn't be expiring passwords either, but that's just another conversation for another day. You can still have the policy set that every authentication requires multi-factor authentication. The trick is that the interval users are prompted to authenticate should not be frequent. The last I knew, and this could have changed, the default behavior in Azure Active Directory was if you sign in with multi-factor authentication, you get, an access token and a refresh token. As long as you exchange that refresh token out and it's like some long interval, like every 28 days, you don't have to re-authenticate unless something substantially changes, like you move into a different conditional access policy or your password expires and you change it. Or a couple of other scenarios. But for the most part, like if a user is using the device regularly and nothing is substantially changed with their identity and their risk level, they should not be reprompted. However, if you go try to sign in from a new device, it's going to ask for MFA. It doesn't care what network you're on. It doesn't matter if the device is enrolled in device management. It doesn't matter any of that. Always MFA. And so that is something that I think a lot of listeners, again, might say, gosh, we're not doing that because we give you an exception if you're on an Intune managed device, or we give you an exception if you're on corporate network. Like there should be no exceptions. Every authentication, every time, multi-factor authentication. Just make it so that MFA is not onerous. That's the solution to that, not relaxing that requirement. That requirement should never be relaxed. Always MFA. And again, recognize, might not be a place you're at today, might be aspirational to where you want to be someday. That's fine. But let's set the North Star is that MFA, your policy and your identity provider is every authentication requires MFA.
Good call out there, Adam. Another one is apply conditional access rules to your applications to defend against application attacks. And this is just, there's multiple ways to do it. Others, identity providers have things like device trust for Okta, but we call it conditional access. So could be requiring a compliant device, could be requiring MFA, but use those conditional access rules to your applications. The next one is use mobile device management and endpoint protection policies, and prohibit running admin on devices to inhibit token theft attacks. I think that one is pretty tough. Although it makes sense that Alex is writing this because this may, again, come down the Microsoft pipeline. We have had admin on our machines, at least for regular users, for a while. We have pause for our privileged access, privileged admins. They have to have very stringent privileged access workstations where they are not administrators probably. So, I don't fault Microsoft for moving in this direction. It makes sense to prevent specific attacks, but I understand that it is difficult to implement. You probably will get some pushback on this if your users have been admins for a while. Limit on-prem exposure and integrate your SOC and identity efforts to ensure that you're defending your identity infrastructure. So this is, that talk that we had about separating out your cloud environment from your on-premise environment, and that also is a journey. And then go with this cloud-first approach. Use agile and adaptable authentication. Try to get automation for some of the common problems so that you can really utilize your resources for either crisis that comes up or other priority projects that you want to implement.
Pretty darn good checklist. Go do those things.
Yep. And that's our show for this week. Thanks as always for listening and watching. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or future topics you want us to talk about. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.